It's one of your favorite verses.
What? Oh yeah, that's that. Well, it's a good prayer for a Bible study. So, all right. So we've got, you all are seeing the collect now.
Yes.
Are we seeing the Woman and the Dragon continued? Or just the collect?
Just the colic.
Okay, so we need to go back to what are we seeing now?
We're now we're the Woman and the Dragon continued.
Okay, that's what we need. So, all right. Hopefully that will keep us in the right place. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. So, as we get ready to start today, does anybody have any questions, comments, thoughts?
Richard,
Yes.
I apologize for blanking out, but I'm looking at my notes. I've got Mark uses the sandwich technique, and for the life of me, I don't remember what the sandwich technique is.
Okay, we're gonna get to the one of the pieces of bread today in the last sandwich. Revelation to John is using what biblical scholars call the sandwich technique, which Mark uses regularly, and it appears periodically in the rest of the New Testament. Imagine that you've got a story that would last for, say, 12 verses, but at some point in the story you insert another passage. So verses 1 through 6 of the story, another story, verses 7 through 12 of the story. The example that I gave last week was in Mark, and right now I'm not remembering the chapter, but early on in Jesus' ministry, his family comes to get him because they think he's crazy. Okay. You get to the point, they say they're coming to see him because they've heard word that he's sort of unbalanced. Then there's the insertion of a story about Pharisees and scribes coming because they say he has a demon, and he responds to them very strongly. And then it goes back to the story of the family saying, oh, your family's outside. They've come to see you. And he says, well, who are my mother and my brothers? They're the people who are gathered here. So that's the sandwich. And the sandwich we had here, which we're going to finish up today, was you had the beginning of the story of the woman and the dragon. The woman who bears a male child. And this is probably symbolically in John's mind, the new Israel, the church, who is showing Jesus to the world, has this conflict with the dragon. And then you have the passage about the war in heaven, the Satan and the other angels fighting against Gabriel. And then it goes back to the story of the woman and the dragon. That's the sandwich technique.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
Who's the dragon?
Well, we went into this a bit last time. You remember that the dragon has 7 heads and 10 crowns and all of that with diadems. And one of the theories is that they represent Roman emperors, the 7 heads. And if you go back to Nero, who we're going to address a little further today and even more later, as sort of the bad guy that everybody looks back to, there are 7 emperors from Nero until the time of Domitian. And the theory is that the revelation to John was written about the year 95, which would have been in Domitian's reign. So, you know, if we're looking at the revelation to John as a book that was addressed to a contemporary audience, you know, what we live with is that it was a book full of hidden wisdom that was locked up. And in popular culture, people will say, no, it's for us right now. And you've got all sorts of people who are saying, well, this is so-and-so, and this is what's happening. And we're all leading up to the end of the world in August. But if, you know, to go back to my beloved New Testament professor, Howard Reese, it must have meant something to them back then, or they wouldn't have put it in the book now, would they? God damn it. And so if you know, and this is a prejudice on my part, I think that biblical literature was addressed to an audience in its own time, and it had a meaning for them. We draw a meaning out of it, and it's a developed meaning that is shaped by living in a different culture, by having had it interpreted for us by preachers over the years. But I think that to go back and try to at least appreciate some of the original meaning, or what we may define as the original meaning, gives us a better stance for interpreting it than somebody who's, you know, as many people have done, has taken every possible reference to the end of the world out of the Bible, going from Daniel and Zechariah, parts of the Gospels, Revelation to John, fragments of Paul's letters, and they've taken and they've shuffled them together like a deck of cards without thinking about their context in their own time, and have come up with this very elaborate, pretty well-defined sense of what God's going to be doing over the next however many years, although God never seems to get around to starting the process. You know, it was going to, you know, like with Hal Lindsey, it was going to start back in, you know, would have started back with the foundation of Israel and come to a climax in 1978, 30 years. But somehow, if Jesus came back in 78, nobody noticed. So to see what is the message, and perhaps what can we take from that for our lives today. So this is the bottom of the sandwich. So when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, and this is probably a little transitional line because of the war between the angels, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. And you remember the male child has been taken up into heaven and is safe up there. But the woman was given the 2 wings of a great eagle so that she could fly from the serpent, and remember the serpent and the dragon have been put together, into the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time. Then from his mouth the serpent poured water like a river after the woman to sweep her away with the flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman. It opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her children, those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. Okay. Some pretty wild imagery. But let's go back first to an earlier part before we get to just right before this part. Remember last week, at the end of the war in heaven, when the serpent was cast down to the earth, we have this hymn. Now that have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah. The accuser of our comrades, and you remember the Satan in the Old Testament was the God's sort of prosecuting attorney, who accuses them day and night before our God. But they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they did not cling to life even in the face of death. And you remember, you've got to remember that victory here, because the Lamb that was slain, Jesus, who died and was raised and was taken up into heaven, that the victory of God is in that motion. The persecuted church is not, at least for the present moment, looking for God to come and lift them out of their situation, rescue them from this, but rather that God will be faithful to raise them. You know, and we can go back much earlier in the book where they're the souls under the altar, whom no one can number. And one of the elders says to John, "Who are these?" And John says, "You're the one that knows." And he says, "These are the ones who have washed their robes in the blood of the Lamb." They're martyrs. Their lifeblood given in testimony for the faith is the same as is tied to the blood of the Lamb. In fact, the language that was used not long after this in the church for those who died a martyr's death, and a martyr just means a witness, someone who testifies, is that they had testified with their blood, so that their suffering is tied into the suffering of the Lamb. But the message is that God is in charge and God will redeem. Rejoice then, you heavens, and those who dwell in them. You know, the heavens are safe. God's in charge. God's got a plan. But woe to the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you with great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And, you know, that time is short as that's the time, times and half a time. The however many days it was, 1,200 and some days, the 3.5 years, that period that keeps getting mentioned. So when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle so that she could fly from the serpent into the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for this period of time. Anytime you hear the wilderness mentioned in this kind of context, we need to think back to the Exodus, because the wilderness was the place where God took his people whom he brought out of bondage in Egypt and formed them as a people, but also in the return from the exile in Babylon, the whole idea of make straight a way in the path in the wilderness for our God, which is a referring back to the Exodus, but that is seen as kind of a second Exodus. So here we have the people of God dispersed through the world, not all together, but in the churches who are out in the wilderness now. But you can see in Exodus, you've seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. And again in Deuteronomy, as an eagle stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, as it spreads its wings, takes them up, and bears them aloft on its pinions, the Lord alone guided him, no foreign god was with him. Okay, the whole idea of eagle's wings in the Exodus, from the ancient world on up through the Middle Ages, there was this idea that eagles carried their babies on their backs as they flew, that they could take them up towards the sun and they could carry them from place to place. Really something that probably never happened. An eagle's back, when it's flying, is not a comfortable place to sit. It's not like a horse. But this is an image that shows up again and again. In fact, one of the first times anybody apparently ever went to explore what an eagle's life was like, there was one of the great medieval teachers, Albertus Magnus. He was one of Thomas Aquinas' college professors. And there was a legend that eagles only gave birth to one baby at a time. And Albert apparently had himself lowered over a cliff down to an eagle's nest so he could look in and see. And there was more than one baby. But up until then, natural history was part observation and part wishful thinking. And you have this return to this theme in Isaiah, and Isaiah 40 is the chapter that begins, comfort ye, my people. And it's the beginning of what scholars refer to as Second Isaiah, which seems to be a book, say, out of the disciples of Isaiah or the school of Isaiah, a century or more after Isaiah, but addressed to the exiles in Babylon, Isaiah having lived before the Babylonian captivity. But Second Isaiah, and there are even those who say there's like another thing they call Third Isaiah, or to really scare the tourists, Tritero Isaiah. But this return from exile that they're talking about in Isaiah, again, they shall mount up with wings like eagles. And so we've moved from the eagle's wings carrying you to you having wings like eagles. And here we have the woman fleeing from persecution. The new Israel is going into the wilderness. This is a new Exodus. But the difference here, just in terms of practicality, if we think of it, is when we think of the Israelites in Egypt, they're sort of in one place. When we think of the exiles in Babylon, they're sort of in one place. It's a gathered community. But the church is dispersed across the empire. It is not geographically exiled, but it's exiled from heaven on earth, surrounded wherever it is by the empire, the dragon, which will also appear soon as the beast. But let's not worry about that too much. Things get fuzzy in apocalyptic literature. Okay. Then from his mouth, the serpent poured water like a river after the woman to sweep her away with the flood. And in the Old Testament, the Hebrew people were not a seagoing people. When Solomon needed to have things shipped to Israel for the building of the temple, he went to the king of Syria. And throughout the Old Testament, there's kind of a discomfort with water. And water is kind of a chaotic force that goes back to probably some old Mesopotamian images. This is a cylinder seal. They had these seals that were in the shape of cylinders that you would roll across clay. And this is an ancient Mesopotamian one. And it's probably one of the gods who is killing this serpent, Tiamat. And Tiamat is a sea serpent. And the world is created in this mythology after this struggle where the god kills Tiamat and builds the creation in the chaotic waters on the body of the serpent. And it's not that like the people in the period of the Revelation of John or even the Old Testament would have been familiar with this story, but in the background of the ancient thought, there was this sense of the seas as kind of a symbol of chaos and of struggle, unformed. You know, if you remember back to the creation story, you know, the earth was without form and void, but it's watery. The storm of God, the Ruach Elohim, the great wind of God blew over the waters that were already there. So, and there are images of sea serpents in Psalms. There go the ships and Leviathan that you formed to sport in it. And then in Isaiah, on that day, the Lord with his cruel and great and strong sword will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent, and he will kill the dragon that is in the sea. So there's this sense that the sea, and we'll come back to the ocean in a minute, that the sea is this chaotic place, that there are dangerous things down in there. And so connecting the serpent with water. I don't know if you remember early on, I think I told you all the story of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was, it's one of the oldest novels in the world. 1,000 years or more before the Old Testament was written. Gilgamesh was an Akkadian king, goes through all sorts of adventures. At one point, a friend is killed by the gods, and he goes to meet the oldest man in the world, Utnapishtim. And Utnapishtim and his wife are immortal. They lived before the flood. They're the two survivors of the flood. Sound familiar? Like Noah and his wife. But there was a plant that you could eat before the flood that would make you immortal. But because of the flood, it's at the bottom of the ocean. But Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how to swim down and get it. And Gilgamesh goes down and he plucks the plant, and he's swimming up to get to land where he can eat it, become immortal. And a snake swims up and scares him, and he drops the plant. So think of just sort of common imagery, but the power of this. There's also the idea, and this goes way, way back. And again, the Hebrews, the Jews, the early church would not have known this, but it's in the common mythology of the ancient world. In the Babylonian flood story, which predates, or not Babylonian, the Mesopotamian flood story that predates the Genesis story, the gods do the flood not because they're angry at people, but because they're jealous of them. People are having too good a time. And when they release the primeval waters for the flood, it gets out of control, and even the gods get scared of what they've done. It's an interesting thing to read, just to see parallel ideas that appear from time to time. So we've got the power of water going to sweep her away with the flood. Remember in Genesis, and what the serpent is doing here repeatedly is kind of imitating things that God does. Remember the flood in Genesis. The earth came to the help of the woman. And here you've got in, and I'm sorry I didn't put the reference down for this first one. But I think that, it is. I'm sorry, this is 1630 up here from Numbers. If the Lord creates something new, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into Sheol, the place of the dead, then you shall know that these men have despised the Lord. That creates something new. There was the sort of primal sin among the Jewish people was not Adam and Eve, but the grumbling in the desert. And you have sort of two major rebellions in the Exodus, Dathan and Abiram, and their people get burned up with fire. But here Korah with 250 men, you know, they get swallowed up. The earth swallowing something is something that God does. Then the dragon was angry with the woman, and he can't get to her because she's in the wilderness. God is protecting her. So he went off to make war with the rest of her children, with those who keep the commandments of God and hold his testimony. Now, I've talked about how translations, they do things to make things more readable. Literally, it's, then the dragon was angry with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her seed. And in Genesis, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and hers. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. And the word in Greek, I don't know the Hebrew, is sperma, which just means a seed. We get sperm from it. But the idea of, you know, their understanding of how birth took place, or conception, was that the sperm was actually a tiny little human being that was planted in the field of the woman, and like a plant grew up into a person. Little bit different than how we view it. But here you have a reference pretty clearly back to Genesis, the enmity between the snake and the woman. And, you know, in its original context, it was probably, this is why people don't like snakes. But it gets expanded since the serpent has become this overwhelming figure of evil, to part of the warfare between the woman and her, between the serpent and the woman's seed. And who are these people? Who are her seed? They are those who keep the commandments of God. And, you know, going back to the Gospel of John, who are these that love me? Those who keep my commandments and hold the testimony of Jesus. This is the church. You know, you might as well just paint the church in this place. This is what's going on. Okay. So, and as I say, we get back to the ocean. Then the dragon took his stand on the sand of the seashore, and I saw a beast rising out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. We're back to the 10 horns and 7 heads. On its horns were 10 diadems. So the horns are wearing like royal crowns, and on its heads were blasphemous names. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, mouth was like a lion's mouth. And the dragon gave it his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. In amazement, the whole earth followed the beast. They worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" All right, here we go to Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanus. Born in 37, died at the age of, took his own life. He had been, the Senate had basically voted him out of office, which meant that they would have killed him. But he committed suicide, reportedly saying the world has lost a great artist at the age of 30. If we go with the theory that the head with the wound that was miraculously healed is Nero, or at least Neronic power, and we can get into this. Nero died in 68. There was a year of civil war, ups and downs. And let me get into Nero in just a minute. Nero was a pretty wild and crazy guy. Very impulsive, bombastic. He was not popular with the ruling class, but he was extremely popular with the Roman populace. And he provided great entertainment for them. Why, you know, the way that Rome had a surplus population of unemployed people. And every Roman citizen in Rome was entitled to free food, a certain amount of bread every day. And if you've ever heard the expression bread and circuses, that comes from that time. And how they kept the population in line was they fed them bread and they gave public entertainments. Anybody, any politician who wanted to curry favor with the people, and that could either be just to say, deal with a difficult situation by saying, don't look at the problem over here, come to the movies, they're free. Or if there was an election and there was a class of people called the plebs, if you've ever heard of a plebiscite or a plebe, the plebs were the voting population and they elected the Senate. But people would get elected to the Senate by throwing games, having a big party, whatever. Well, Nero was a master of this and was very popular with the common populace. But he was blamed for burning Rome in the Christian church. He blamed the Roman fire on the Christians. And we have a historian, Tertullian, contemporary historian, who gives an account of what Nero did. But he had some really spectacular ways of killing Christians. And we don't, you know, we have things like people compare football games to gladiatorial combat because you got these big guys fighting each other. Well, the difference between the gladiatorial combats of the ancient world and the football games is people hunt out football players who are talented and big, and they pay them lots of money to do it. One of the things you could be sentenced to if you committed a capital crime was death in the arena. And so a lot of gladiators were people who were sentenced to the arena. Now, if they were good at it and they survived again and again and again, they would they could be freed because they had sort of worked off their sentence. But when you take just ordinary people off the street and you condemn them for belonging to a banned religion, that because they're outsiders, you can say, oh, well, you know, they set fire to Rome or they did whatever. You just sort of let them loose in the arena and let wild animals there loose, kill them. It was that, you know, people say it happened in the Colosseum because of a variety of things in the ancient world and what was normal. The Colosseum probably had gladiatorial combats, but not Christian persecution. That would have been in the circus, Circus Maximus. Circus just means a round or oval place. But there was, but if you think of a sort of ideal bad guy, Nero's too long ago for us to recognize. You know, think instead of something like this. Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin. Anybody here familiar with Godwin's Law? Okay, Godwin's Law, you have to be an internet geek to do this. Godwin's Law is if you're in an argument on the internet with somebody, the first person to bring up the Nazis loses the argument because they're so bad. They are so evil that to compare anybody to Hitler is to just step outside of the bounds. But yet we do have these images, these people we remember as being spectacularly evil, and they're sort of always in the background. And if we really dislike somebody, we'll say, oh, well, they're like Hitler or they're like the Nazis. So, you know, the idea and the, well, we'll get into it in a minute. So, then the dragon, took his stand on the sand of the seashore, and, he is just out of the water. He's right there at this chaotic place where the sea serpents live, that's capable of rising up in a storm and doing an incredible amount of damage, all of that. And he's standing on the seashore. And what happens while he's standing there? I saw a beast rising out of the sea. And it's got the familiar, we've seen the 10 horns and 7 heads and the 10 diadems. I haven't seen the blasphemous names before, but we'll get to that. And then we've got this beast, and it was like a leopard, but its feet were like a bear's and its mouth was like a lion's. And this is, you know, we get these sort of sewn together figures in apocalyptic literature. First of all, in terms of the blasphemy, this statue, speaking of the Emperor Domitian, this is a statue of the genius of the Emperor Domitian. And starting in the imperial period, and you have to understand, Rome was a republic up until Julius Caesar. And it wasn't a republic like our republic, but they did have, they were ruled by a senate. And throughout Roman history, everything, even under the emperors, had SPQR on it. Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the people of Rome. And from the time of Julius Caesar on, Rome was ruled by one or more military dictators. When you think Roman emperor, when you think a Caesar, think military dictator. But everything they did, they said they were doing in the name of the Senate and the people of Rome, even though the Senate had no, it had a certain amount of power, but it could only use it at certain times. You know, Nero had sort of done enough crazy things so that they could vote him out. But ordinarily, they might have trouble doing that because the emperor would have had control of the army. If you think of, you know, the moment in the downfall of the Soviet Union, where the tanks come up to the Duma, but you know, the then premier comes out and settles it all down. But up at the top here are titles that the emperor had. Kyrios, which is Greek for Lord. This was a real problem for Christians because the earliest Christian creed was that Jesus was the Kyrios. Jesus was the Lord. Sebastos, Augustus, means worthy of reverence. Deus means divine, and that the emperor is Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. And there was in the Roman Empire, when scholars use the word cult, don't think cult like the Moonies, think a religious system. So Christianity could be referred to as the Christian cult. Judaism is the Jewish cult. It's just a body, in scholarly terms, it's a body of religious beliefs. Well, the Roman Empire lived with this worship of the emperor, which you engaged in every time you paid your taxes. Now, this is a full-size statue, but the tax office would have a tiny statue of the genius of the emperor. And when you paid your taxes, you would burn a pinch of incense and say, Caesar is Lord, which was, for the Romans, the equivalent of putting your hand over your heart and saying, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. They couldn't understand why somebody wouldn't want to do this. What could be wrong with it? You know, this is the official religion of the empire. You got all sorts of other religions, and we let them do whatever they want. Christianity is not one of them. Judaism is. And I think Jews were even allowed not to do that, but they had a sort of special relationship. So here are the blasphemous names that are on the horns of the beast. This like a leopard, like a bear, and like a lion. In the book of Daniel, there are 3 beasts, and I've cut out the descriptions of their teeth and their wings and their claws, but each one is described in a really dangerous way. But each of these beasts pretty much can be identified in Daniel's teaching as representatives of a different empire. So you've got the lion, you've got the bear, and you've got the leopard. Sound familiar? Just like in the Revelation, only there are 3 separate beasts. And the first would probably be the Assyrian Empire, the second, the Babylonian Empire, the third, the empire of Alexander the Great, and then the 4th beast for Daniel would have been the Seleucid Empire, the empire of the 4 generals who split up, who inherited Alexander's empire, and which are the this is the same period as the Maccabees, are invading the temple, setting pagan idols in it, actively working to not just discourage, but end Jewish practices like circumcision and bring in Greek culture. And so we have this 4th beast, great iron teeth, devouring, breaking in pieces, stamping what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that preceded it, and it had 10 horns. So, Revelation to John, you're looking back to Daniel, and this is essentially the 4th beast. It's a combination of all the other beasts. So, one of its heads seemed to have received a death blow, but its mortal wound had been healed. So we have in heaven the lamb that was slain and had risen from the dead. Here we have the opposite, seemed to have received a death blow, but its wound had been healed. Nero committed suicide, but hey presto, you've got Vespasian a year later. Another emperor rises up. But there was also the myth of Nero Redux, the idea in the Christian church that lasted probably till around the 8th century, that Nero was going to come back, that we were going to have another Nero who would initiate another really bad, strange, violent persecution. Now, we're going to have, here we have the beast, and we're going to see the beast again and again. And in popular use of apocalyptic writings, we have the idea that there will be someone called the Antichrist. And they use the beast synonymously with the Antichrist. And the word Antichrist only appears in 1st and 2nd John. And in the popular use of this, the question is, who is the Antichrist? And in history, everybody from Genghis Khan to Napoleon to Hitler, Barack Obama. I had a gospel tract that I lost over the years. I used to keep a file in my file cabinet called religious pornography that was just little strange, odd religious bits, and it got lost in a move. But I had a gospel tract that proved without a doubt that Spiro Agnew was the Antichrist. Go figure. But the idea that we're going to have some Antichrist who is going, and in the popular use of it, going to bring world peace, probably working with some evil group like the United Nations, God forbid, will bring about this false peace that will usher in a great age of apostasy. It's interesting that when the term is used in 1 John, you have heard that Antichrist is coming. Well, many Antichrists have already come. Who is the liar? Antichrist, but the one who denies that Jesus is the Christ. This is the Antichrist, the one who denies the Father and the Son. And then he also goes on to say, the spirit of Antichrist, of which you have heard that it is coming and is now already in the world. So in 1 John, this idea is sort of a broader one. It is like terrorism. It's not one thing. It's a behavior. In amazement, the whole earth followed the beast. And, from the point of view of the church, the Roman Empire is universal. It's everywhere. It's all powerful. This is around the period, probably a little before, and maybe they were saying it then, but we have it recorded later, when the early church was referred to by its critics as a religion for women and slaves. And no offense to the women present, but women were definitely second or third or fourth class citizens. They weren't even citizens at all. Only men, property owning men, were citizens. But you have this small, not powerful group that is living discouraged within a larger, overwhelming culture. We live in a culture that, even though there are sort of ups and downs for the Christian church, that accepts Christianity as the norm. Okay? Imagine living as a Christian in Turkey or communist China. It's a different experience. So you're looking around and seeing that this beast, this Roman Empire, is, at least on earth, all powerful. Who is like the beast and who can fight against it? And you do have, and Norma and I talked about this a bit, the Caesar is Lord versus Jesus is Lord. And St. Paul in 1 Corinthians says that when the pagans engage in sacrifice, whatever sacrifice it is, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I don't want you to be partners with demons, which was all part of an argument over whether you could buy your Sunday roast at the butcher shop at the pagan temple. Another whole story. But the idea that this worship of the dragon, this worship of the beast, Caesar is Lord, is a worship of demonic beings. Again, back to what's behind it all is the serpent. Okay. Now, just a little side note and something that I'm very fond of. And, this is just something more recent that's similar to the Roman worship of the genius of the emperor. Over the years, kingdoms and empires seem to want to find a divine origin or a divine purpose for what they're doing. So we have the Roman Empire, the Caesars, underlining their power by saying that there's a part of me, my genius, my guiding spirit, is divine. The gods are on my side. So if you don't do what I want you to do, there's going to be a famine. There's going to be a plague. There's going to be an earthquake. And, in the ancient world, famines, plagues, and earthquakes just happened randomly, but famines and plagues were common enough that if things were going bad, the emperor could say, well, it's because of those dirty, rotten, stinking, nasty Christians, and you all ought to go and beat up on them rather than looking at me. Politicians do that to this day with other groups. But in the late 19th century, when the British Empire was at its height, tiny little island of Great Britain had an empire that included Canada, it included India, it had control, well, actually the mandate didn't really come in until World War I, but it had a certain amount of political supervision over Egypt. It had Australia, it had African colonies. It was the largest, most spread out empire the world has ever known. And this was a period where visiting Egypt and British exploration of archaeological exploration of Egypt, because they had this sort of political supervision, was at its height. And British Israelism, which is, I say, I love. It's wonderful. It is religious pornography at its finest. They came up with the theory that the British nation was composed of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, that when they had been lost, they had all just gone to England and settled down. How do you know this? Well, do you all know what the Hebrew word for covenant is? It's berith. B, little mark, R-I-T-H, berith, or sometimes written B-E-R-I-T-H. Well, what is the name of Great Berethan mean? The Great Covenant. What a surprise. Earlier on, there were people who said it came from Brutus and that Brutus had founded England, but that's a different mythology. And here we got the Great Pyramid, and there were people who would take measurements of like how long it was from the bottom to the top, and how long different hallways were, and how high and wide they were. And if you took what they called a pyramid foot, it's not an ordinary length foot, it's a pyramid foot that's either a little longer or a little shorter, and you measure height or the length of this hallway or whatever, you can come up with all the dates in British history. But the thing is, you could probably do that with the Empire State Building and have an Empire State Building foot. If you get a number of numbers, you can factor it down to a sort of common thing. And so, has anyone here ever heard of the Stone of Scone? Okay, there's this rock, it's this big, and it was used when they would crown kings in Scotland. They would sit on that stone. And when James VI of Scotland became James I of England, the stone was brought down to London and was put under, they built a throne that had a space for the Stone of Scone. And so the British, the rulers of the United Kingdom of England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, included the Scottish line in that by having that stone under the throne. Well, it's been moved back to Scotland, but it's brought down for coronation. But you know what that stone was? It was the stone on which Abraham bound Isaac. And it's just been carried all along. And when the 10 lost tribes came to Israel, they brought it. Now, the fact that it's this big by this big by this big, you know, you're not going to have an easy time tying up a boy and lying him across it. He'd hurt his back. But still, that's the story. So there was this whole theory that the British Empire, and it was never the official view of Great Britain, but it was really popular and spread. And there were all sorts of books like this, Anglo-Israel, or The British Nation, The Lost Tribes of Israel, by the Reverend W.H. Poole, published in Canada here. But at any rate, you had this theory that the British Empire had a kind of divine origin. Therefore, whatever it did was right. A little parallel to this that we see today, and particularly with the revelation to John, this is John Hagee's organization, Christians United for Israel. And you see you have the Israeli flag and the American flag worn together. There was a church down the road that's now closed, but that used to have the Israeli flag and the American flag on the same flagpole. And this is a group that is very much involved in end times thought, and they want America to really support Israel, particularly conservative politics in Israel, so that things like the rebuilding of the temple can happen. Because if we support that and that happens, then all of the dominoes are lined up for Jesus to come back. But unless that happens, in their point of view, God's hands are tied. Again, I think it's an interesting view of God, where you think that something, happening in contemporary politics, but it is a view that begins to mix certain religious views with certain patriotic views. And that's right. Yeah. So, yeah. All right. Well, we've come to the end of our time. We'll pick up next week with some more about our friend the beast. At this point, anybody have any questions or thoughts?
What are the 10 lost tribes of Israel?
Okay. There were 2 conquests of what we think of as Israel. In ancient Israel, there were 2 kingdoms. After Solomon, there was a split in the kingdoms. And so you had the kingdom of Judah, which was in the south, which was around Jerusalem, and then the kingdom of Samaria in the north. And its capital was Samaria, and they had their own temple in Samaria. And so basically, the southern kingdom was 2 tribes. I mean, there were people from all the tribes all around, but ancestral ownership of land, those are the 2 tribes. Well, 100 years or more before the Babylonian conquest of Judah, the Assyrians conquered Israel. And they came in and they just took most of the people who were living there, not all, but most of them, and shipped them off who knows where, somewhere in the Assyrian Empire. And they brought people from another part and resettled them there. I mean, if you want to not have trouble with a captive population, don't leave them in the land. That was their way of doing it. So 10 of the tribes of Israel, in a certain sense, disappeared from history. Now, there are Jewish people who can claim descent from each of those, but they lost their ancestral lands, they lost their political, geographical identity. So, in a sense, in a very simplified view, 10 of the tribes of Israel are lost to history, and we don't know what happened to them. The Babylonians took the ruling class and the artisanal class of the Jewish people off to Babylon, or near Babylon. And then after a couple of generations, when the Persians conquered the Babylonians, they let them come back. That's the return from exile. So the idea is that rather than being, or at least for the British, dispersed, you've got these 10 tribes that are sort of there to settle somewhere else. But the Mormons say they came to America. That they were sent to Egypt and they got on boats and they came to America and became the American Indians. So, and part of that is when Joseph Smith was coming up with his ideas, they had just discovered pyramids in Central America. I've got the book that everybody was reading at that time, Stephen's Yucatan, and it had illustrations of pyramids. And people were saying, well, there were pyramids in Egypt, there are pyramids in Central America. What makes more sense than that the 10 lost tribes of Israel brought the idea of pyramids? Go figure.
So the people that the Assyrians brought in, were they Jewish?
No, and in fact, that was why the Samaritans, you know, the Samaritans in the Bible, the Samaritans are viewed as an isolated, bad group, as you had people who were brought in, they intermarried with the people who were left behind and practiced what they thought was a form of Orthodox Judaism. The problem is that they don't get it quite right. And from the point of view of the people in Judah, for a lot of reasons that I don't have time to go into today, but also they were racially mixed. And there was particularly following the Babylonian captivity, when the people returned to Judah, there was an emphasis on racial purity, which you can see in Ezra and Nehemiah. You know, if there were people in Judah who had mixed marriages, at least as Ezra and Nehemiah tell it, they kicked them out. Okay. Well, like I say, I got to go and do the healing service.
Thank you.
But thank you all. And we will see y'all next week.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Richard.